Hello again folks, and welcome to the fourth in our exclusive Patreon series of deeper dive videos looking at the IPCC AR6 synthesis report published on the 20th of March 2023. This penultimate segment deals with carbon budgets and net zero emissions and how we might try to stay within those limits, which is of course much easier said than done. The straightforward physical science tells us that limiting human-caused global warming to those specific levels requires limiting cumulative CO2 emissions, which means getting to net zero emissions, which, as we saw in my recent video, implies that carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, will be necessary to achieve net negative emissions in the long run. The scientists tell us that for every 1,000 billion tonnes of CO2 emitted by human activity, global surface temperature rises by 0.45 degrees Celsius. So the best estimates of the remaining carbon budgets from the beginning of 2020 are 500 more billion tonnes of CO2 emissions for a 50% likelihood of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C and 1,150 more billion tonnes for a 67% likelihood of limiting warming to 2 degrees C. The report states that if our current annual CO2 emissions stayed as they are now for the next 7 years to 2030, the resulting cumulative emissions would almost exhaust the remaining carbon budget for 1.5C and use up more than a third of the remaining carbon budget for 2 degrees C. Estimates of future CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructures, assuming they don't all start bolting carbon capture equipment onto their exhaust flues, already exceed the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. Essentially, our cumulative net CO2 emissions from 1850 to 2019 of about 2,900 billion tonnes have already used up about 4/5 of the total carbon budget for a 50% probability of limiting global warming to 1.5C. So wiggle room is now basically non-existent, really. Here's a chart that I'm sure we're all now very familiar with. It shows that all global model pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees C with no or limited overshoot, and those that limit warming to 2 degrees C overall, involve rapid, deep and immediate emissions reductions in all sectors this decade, with emissions levels peaking by 2025, which of course is only a couple of years from now. It's not just carbon dioxide though, as you know. We've got to hammer methane and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases like HFCs too. The report tells us that in model pathways that limit warming to 1.5C with no or limited overshoot, global methane emissions have to be reduced by between 21 and 57% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. All global modelled mitigation pathways that reach net zero require either a rapid transition to renewables or the addition of carbon capture and storage onto existing fossil fuel production facilities, which is something most commentators are extremely sceptical about. We'll also need demand-side measures and improved efficiencies and global-scale reforestation, as well as massive reduction or even cessation of current deforestation. Now, the report says there are some nice synergies that the world could achieve if it was to fully embrace these mitigation measures. For example, biological carbon dioxide removal methods like reforestation, improved forest management, soil carbon sequestration, peatland restoration, and coastal blue carbon management can enhance biodiversity and ecosystem functions and improve the employment prospects and livelihoods of local people. But we also need to be very mindful of potentially harmful methods like badly executed afforestation or the production of biomass crops, which can have adverse socio-economic and environmental impacts on biodiversity, food and water security, local livelihoods, and the rights of indigenous peoples. If, as is now expected, we do go over the 1.5 degree limit, then the IPCC still maintain that it could be possible to bring temperatures back down again later on in the century, mainly via the panacea of carbon dioxide removal. But they make the very important point that any overshoot will bring adverse impacts, some of which will be irreversible, and it will heighten the risks for human and natural systems. So we'll see increased wildfires, mass mortality of trees, drying of peatlands, and permafrost thawing, weakening natural land carbon sinks, causing the release of even more greenhouse gases that would make the return to safe temperature levels even more challenging. I touched on these issues in my recent video about emissions pathways, which if you're watching this on the YouTube platform and you're on a PC, laptop or tablet, you can jump back to by clicking up there somewhere. This next chart illustrates the rapidly narrowing window of opportunity for climate resilient development. It contains one of the central tenets that I've been banging on about for years, and which I strongly believe is the linchpin to success in fighting climate change. And that's this little image over here on the left-hand side. I often refer to this as the three legs of a stool, and it's the relationship between government, the private sector, and civil society. That relationship, in my view, is badly broken at the moment as a result of corruption, corporate lobbying, consumer exploitation, overzealous marketing, and rapidly decreasing levels of trust on all sides. And here's why I think our actions as individuals can make a difference. I regularly receive comments about individual efforts being nothing more than a drop in the ocean, and so why should I as an individual even bother? But as the cliche goes, oceans are made up of drops. So when individual action becomes collective action, and that action is focused on things that make governments and businesses sit up and listen, and I'm not talking about uprisings and revolutions or blocking motorways and smashing windows in corporate office blocks. I mean altering your buying choices as consumers, or removing your pension money or your bank accounts from organisations that invest in fossil fuels. And I mean demonstrating outside your national parliaments and harassing your elected representatives en masse until they realise that they'll need to keep you and your fellow citizens on side if they want to get re-elected. Even in heavily capitalistic free market economies like the United States, governments will need to play a vital role in incentivising businesses to do the right thing and penalising them for doing the wrong thing. It's one of the key roles of central government. I'd very strongly recommend reading this book by Professor Mariana Mazzucato called The Entrepreneurial State, in which she sets out multiple historical examples from medicine to tech, including companies like Tesla Motors, where governments have provided the seed investment for those kinds of startups. It's not all rosy gardens and kumbaya though. Professor Mazzucato shows how government investment has enabled businesses on many occasions to share the risks of starting up by allowing them to write off government money if they fail, but with no contractual obligation to give back a percentage of their profits if they succeed. It's a classic example of bad deal making by bureaucratic government wonks coming up against streetwise commercial operators. The result has been increasing inequality and the jeopardisation of future innovation. That model has to change, but if it can be operated correctly, this tripartite relationship becomes a virtuous self-reinforcing circle. Anyway, rant over. The IPCC offers the following commentary on the rest of this graphic. Diverging pathways illustrate that interacting choices and actions made by diverse government, private sector and civil society actors can advance climate resilient development, shift pathways towards sustainability and enable lower emissions and adaptation. Diverse knowledge and values include cultural values, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge and scientific knowledge. Climatic and non-climatic events such as droughts, floods or pandemics pose more severe shocks to pathways with lower climate resilient development than to pathways with higher climate resilient development. There are limits to adaptation and adaptive capacity for some human and natural systems at 1.5 degrees C, and with every increment of warming, losses and damages will increase. The development pathways taken by countries at all stages of economic development impact greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation challenges and opportunities, which vary across countries and regions. Pathways and opportunities for action are shaped by previous actions or inactions and opportunities missed, which are indicated by this dotted line up here. The longer emissions reductions are delayed, the fewer effective adaptation options are available. So far, we've covered the risks and threats of runaway global warming, and we've looked at what would need to be done right now to prevent the worst of it happening. The last link in the chain, if you like, is the means to achieve mitigation measures and the will to do so, which means looking at technology, society, economics and politics which is what we'll do in the fifth and final section of this series. See you there.